He walked off the set, cameras still rolling, lights blazing, millions watching at home, and Danny DeVito, 80 years old, one of the most recognized faces on the planet, just walked away. No explanation, no apology, just gone. The internet exploded within minutes. Clips everywhere, hashtags trending. Half the world called it a meltdown. The other half called it the most honest thing they'd seen on television in years. But here's the question nobody was asking in all that noise. What kind of life does a man have to live to reach 80 years old and still have that much fire left? Because Danny DeVito's story isn't what you think it is. It's not the rags to riches fairy tale Hollywood loves to sell. It's something harder than that. Something sadder. Something that, once you know it, changes how you see every single role he ever played. This is the truth about Danny DeVito. And most of it, he kept hidden for decades. It starts before he was even born. His mother, Julia, was 40 years old when she found out she was pregnant again. She already had children. She was tired, and she didn't hide how she felt. Not then, and not later. Years after Danny became famous, she said it out loud in an interview. I didn't want him. 4 words. Just 4. But imagine being the person those 4 words are about. Imagine growing up in a house where the woman who carried you into the world looked at you and felt something close to regret. Most people would spend the rest of their lives chasing that missing approval, shrinking themselves, becoming whatever someone else needed them to be. Danny did the opposite, but his mother's feelings were only the beginning. His father, Daniel Sr., owned a candy shop in Asbury Park. During the day, he was warm, friendly, the kind of man the neighbors liked. But when the sun went down and the bottles came out, something shifted. The warmth disappeared. The noise started, and a small boy in that house learned very quickly how to read a room. Danny learned to listen for the sound of bottles. He tracked the way his father's footsteps changed as the night went on. Sometimes he hid in closets. Sometimes he ran. Between 1950 and 1955, police were called to that house at least 17 times. 17 times before Danny was even 15 years old. He never talked about this publicly for decades, but it never left him either. You don't survive a childhood like that without carrying it somewhere. In your chest, in your jaw, in the way you tense up when a room gets loud. What he did with it, though, is where the story gets interesting. By 14, Danny had made a decision. His neighborhood was falling apart. Heroin was moving through the streets like water. 2 of his childhood friends were dead before they turned 16. He looked at the world he'd been handed and made a quiet, determined choice. He was getting out. He saved $237 from odd jobs. He convinced his parish priest to speak to his parents, and he timed his ask carefully. He approached his father only when the man was sober and still carrying the guilt of the night before. It worked. He left for oratory prep school. Of the 12 friends he grew up with, only 3 made it past 25 without prison or addiction. Danny was one of the 3. But there was something he couldn't outrun. Something written into his body from the beginning. He has a condition called Fairbanks disease. It's rare. Most people have never heard of it. It's a bone disorder that doesn't just affect how tall you grow. It affects how you feel every single day. His joints, his hips, his knees, his back. For most of his 20s and 30s, his pain level hovered between 6 and 8 out of 10. Every day. Not on bad days. Every day. He never told anyone. He did his own stunts. He collapsed 4 times on the set of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and told everyone it was part of the performance. He turned down pain medication even when doctors pushed it because he'd watched what substances did to people he loved. And quietly, over the years, he donated more than $12 million to fund research for others with bone conditions like his. He never put his name on a single project. He didn't want credit. He just wanted people to suffer less. A man in constant pain, quietly paying for strangers to feel better, while Hollywood told him to keep his mouth shut about all of it. We'll come back to what happened when he finally stopped staying quiet. Before the movies, before the fame, Danny DeVito was a beautician. Not dabbling. He trained for 1,500 hours, graduated second in his class, and went to work at his sister Angela's salon, a place called, brilliantly, Curl Up and Die. Clients booked months in advance. He won awards. His signature style was called the Neptune twist. Then one afternoon, a client's husband walked in, a theater producer. He told Danny to come audition for a play. That's how it started. Not a dream, not a plan. A conversation in a hair salon in New Jersey. In 1962, he applied to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, thinking he'd study makeup. They asked him to perform a monologue. He'd never done one before. He picked a scene from The Rainmaker and gave it everything he had. They offered him a spot, not for makeup, for acting. He went back to the salon, thought about it for 3 days. Then the school called again, with a partial scholarship. That second call changed the entire direction of his life. New York City. A tiny apartment. Cockroaches. Barely any heat. $75 a month in rent that 2 young men could barely scrape together. Danny DeVito and his roommate, a quiet guy named Michael Douglas, who never mentioned his father was Kirk Douglas, ate beans and stale bread and dreamed about making it. One week, they pooled their last $27, printed headshots, and hand-delivered them to casting offices across the city. Douglas started getting callbacks. Danny kept getting doors closed in his face, but the friendship held. Years later, when Michael Douglas became the producer of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he remembered his old roommate and asked for him by name. That's the role that cracked everything open. But between that broke apartment and that breakthrough were years of rejection that would have destroyed most people. Between 1967 and 1970, Danny auditioned 248 times. He got 3 small gigs, earned less than $800 total. He parked cars. He stood motionless in a store window pretending to be a mannequin. He cleaned cages at the LA Zoo and read his lines out loud to chimpanzees to keep his skills sharp. For a stretch of time, he lived in his car, an old VW Beetle. He showered at the YMCA and ate at soup kitchens. He kept that story to himself for decades. Hollywood, meanwhile, had ideas about what should happen to Danny DeVito. Producers, agents, executives. They came to him with a proposal: change, surgery to lengthen his legs, procedures to alter his face. One studio put together a formal offer worth nearly $1 million in today's money, contingent on him going through with it. He took the contract to a beach bonfire and burned it. His response to a casting director who pushed him stayed with him for years. I'd rather be a first-rate version of myself than a second-rate version of someone else. He meant every word. Then his father got sick. Danny was grinding through overnight shifts at a printing press, dealing with depression he barely talked about, barely getting home. When his father died, it broke something in him that the poverty and rejection hadn't quite managed to reach. He applied for a postal job. He was genuinely thinking about walking away. On the same day the offer letter arrived, the phone rang. There was an audition. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. His old roommate had asked for him by name. He put the postal letter down and made the other choice. He was on screen for 5 minutes and 52 seconds. Director Milos Forman fought the studio to keep him. The film was shot inside a real psychiatric hospital, with real patients as extras. The atmosphere was heavy and strange, and Danny brought something raw to those 5 minutes that couldn't be manufactured. The film won 5 Oscars. Danny wasn't nominated, but for the first time, people knew his name. Then he made a decision that everyone around him thought was insane. He turned down 3 film roles to audition for a TV sitcom called Taxi. His agent said it was career suicide. At the audition, instead of reading lines, he performed a full 7-minute monologue that left the room completely still. ABC was nervous about his height. Show creator James L. Brooks threatened to quit if they didn't cast him. Danny didn't negotiate his salary. He signed immediately, even though the contract paid 40% less than what other cast members were making. He just wanted the role. Within 8 episodes, he received more than 11,000 fan letters. For a supporting character, for a character this unlikable. What almost nobody knew was how he prepared. Before every scene, he would sit alone and quietly list every person who had ever rejected him. Every door closed. Every audition that ended in silence. He fed all of that into Louis De Palma. That anger wasn't an act. By 1980, 93% of Americans could recognize Louis from his voice alone. He won a Golden Globe, then an Emmy, shocking the industry. since some judges hadn't wanted to nominate a character this unpleasant. When he took the microphone, he said 12 words. "Thank you. I'm really happy about this. Taxi is the best show on television." The shortest acceptance speech in Emmy history. NBC offered him his own show, $175,000 per episode. He said no. He wanted to stay with the cast. She had actually come to break up with his roommate. Rhea Perlman walked into Danny's apartment one evening to end a relationship, and instead spent 6 hours talking to the short man with a loud laugh who lived there. Danny later said he knew within 22 minutes that he wanted to marry her. She joined the Taxi cast a year later. The producers had no idea they were together. The chemistry everyone assumed was brilliant acting was just two people completely in love. They married in 1982. Together, working nights and weekends, they built Jersey Films. Over the next decade, it became one of Hollywood's most influential independent studios, producing Pulp Fiction on $8 million, giving Tarantino office space and a check when every other studio had passed. They made Matilda, which is where one of the quietest, most beautiful moments of Danny's life happened. He played the awful father. He cast Rhea as the mother. The young star, Mara Wilson, was 9 years old, and her mother was dying of cancer during production. Danny and Rhea wrapped around that little girl like family. When her mother's condition became critical, Danny brought a near-final cut of the film to the hospital so she could see her daughter on screen before she passed. Mara Wilson would later say they felt like her favorite aunt and uncle. This is the Danny DeVito that never made the tabloids. But the pain never stopped. Fairbanks' disease doesn't pause for award seasons. Hollywood told him to keep it quiet, appear weak, lose work. So he kept going. During It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, he would finish a scene and collapse off camera the moment the director called cut. His mornings started at 4:30 a.m., with 4 hours of physical therapy. A tiny trampoline, hot and cold baths, hanging upside down in his trailer between takes. In 2012, after 30 years, he and Rhea separated. They went to 38 sessions of therapy. He rented out the restaurant from their first date. They were seen holding hands again, stayed together for more years. Then in 2017, they separated for good. But they never divorced. No courtroom. No attorneys tearing them apart publicly. In 2019, Danny bought a house less than a mile from hers. They talk every Wednesday and Sunday. Every month, they meet at the same restaurant at the same table. Their son once said they still share a Netflix account and text each other while watching the same shows from different houses. Whatever they are now, it isn't over. It just changed shape. In 2023, he donated $500,000 to the hospital where he was born. Directly. Personally. No press conference. He just did it. And then, after decades of silence, after decades of Hollywood telling him to hide it, he started talking about the disease. Not for himself. For kids who can't afford treatment. For people living with bone conditions that nobody takes seriously because they're not glamorous enough for a ribbon campaign. He started asking out loud why Hollywood still acts like only one kind of body belongs on screen. The whispers started. No formal statements. But doors began quietly closing. His honesty, some said, was costing him. He kept talking anyway. Which brings us back to that night on Jimmy Kimmel Live. May 2025. An 80-year-old man sits down for what's supposed to be a friendly interview. That's not what happened. Something shifted mid-conversation. The argument that followed was heated enough that Danny stood up and walked off set while cameras were still rolling. Security stepped in, not to remove him, but to keep things from getting worse. The clips flooded social media within minutes. Half the internet cheered. The other half called it a breakdown. Bill Burr defended him publicly. Late-night hosts made jokes. It became a cultural moment, whether anyone planned it or not. A few days later, Danny posted online. No apology. Just this. I stand by everything I said. Sometimes the truth isn't easy to hear, especially under the lights. Kimmel responded that he had nothing but respect for Danny and hoped they could laugh about it one day. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But think about what you just heard. A man who spent decades being told to be quieter, smaller, more accommodating, who was offered $1 million to physically change his body and burned the contract instead, who hid a bone disease for 40 years because Hollywood told him to, then finally spoke up anyway. That man, at 80 years old, is still saying exactly what he thinks. That's not a meltdown. That's a life lived entirely on his own terms. He's still working, producing a sports documentary series for Prime Video with his kids as co-producers. Still showing up every week on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, crawling out of couches and saying things so outrageous that rooms full of people lose their minds. 80 years old, body carrying decades of pain, doing exactly what he was told he could never do. His mother said she didn't want him. Look what he built anyway.